An entire empire can vanish in a single storm. History remembers the kings and the generals, but it often forgets the silent partner in every great human drama, the weather itself. We are about to journey through 25 incredible moments where a sudden fog, a freak hurricane, or a bitter frost completely rewrote the story of our world. You will discover the true, untold force behind some of history's most pivotal turning points. How did a blanket of fog save a revolution? What mysterious global winter inspired a monster? By the end, you will see the forecast not as a simple prediction, but as a glimpse into the forces that can make or break civilizations. What is the most powerful storm you have ever witnessed? In the late 13th century, the world's most powerful empire set its sights on a chain of islands at its edge. Kublai Khan, the Mongol ruler of a vast domain stretching from Eastern Europe to the Sea of Japan, demanded submission. When Japan refused, he dispatched a colossal invasion force. In 1274, an armada of nearly 900 ships carrying tens of thousands of seasoned warriors landed in Hakata Bay. The samurai defenders fought with ferocious bravery, but they were being pushed back by the Mongols' superior numbers and their brutal, coordinated tactics. Just as a complete defeat seemed inevitable, the sky darkened. A monstrous typhoon slammed into the coast, churning the sea into a frenzy. The Mongol fleet trapped in the bay was utterly destroyed. Ships were dashed against the rocks and thousands of soldiers drowned. The invasion was over. 7 years later, Kublai Khan tried again, this time with a force of staggering proportions. Historical accounts suggest a fleet of over 4,000 ships and an army that may have exceeded 100,000 men. It was one of the largest naval invasion forces the world would see for centuries. For nearly 2 months, a desperate and outnumbered band of samurai held the Mongol armada at bay along the coast of Kyushu. Then, on the 15th of August 1281, the weather turned. Another typhoon, even more powerful than the first, struck with unimaginable fury. The massive fleet, with its ships tethered together for stability, had no chance. The storm raged for 2 full days, scattering wooden vessels like toys and drowning the vast majority of the Mongol army. To the watching Japanese, this was no mere coincidence. They saw it as a divine intervention, a kamikaze, a divine wind sent by the gods to protect their sacred islands. The impact of these 2 storms echoed for centuries. Japan was saved from foreign conquest, allowing its unique culture, political structure, and social traditions to develop in isolation. The myth of divine protection became a cornerstone of Japanese national identity, a powerful narrative that the islands were sacred and inviolable. This belief in a nation shielded by the gods would profoundly influence Japanese thought, art, and even military strategy right up into the modern era. What if those typhoons had never formed? The entire cultural and political landscape of East Asia would be unrecognizable. It is a stunning reminder that the fate of a nation can sometimes rest on the unpredictable path of a storm. Just over 3 centuries after the Kamikaze saved Japan, the fate of Europe was decided by a similar, brutal force of nature. In 1588, King Philip II of Spain, ruler of the most powerful empire on earth, assembled a colossal fleet known as the Spanish Armada. His goal was nothing less than the conquest of Protestant England and the overthrow of its queen, Elizabeth I. The Armada was a floating fortress of 130 ships, carrying 19,000 soldiers and 8,000 sailors. Its plan was to sail to the Netherlands, pick up an additional army of 30,000 veteran troops, and ferry them across the English Channel for a final, crushing invasion. England's smaller, more nimble navy, led by skilled commanders like Sir Francis Drake, knew they could not defeat this Goliath in a traditional head-on battle. Instead, they waged a war of harassment. They used their speed and long-range cannons to snipe at the Spanish formation. capturing or destroying several key ships while avoiding a close quarters melee where the Spanish soldiers could board and overwhelm them. The English tactics were effective, but they were not decisive. The Armada, though bloodied, remained a powerful, cohesive force. It was at this critical moment that the weather took command. A series of powerful gales, the kind that churned the North Sea into a maelstrom, savaged the Spanish fleet. The great galleons, designed for the calmer waters of the Mediterranean, were scattered and driven north around the treacherous coasts of Scotland and Ireland. One by one, ships were dashed against rocky shores, supplies ran out, and sailors weakened by hunger and thirst succumbed to the frigid, storm-tossed seas. Of the 130 ships that had set out with such confidence, fewer than half managed to limp back to Spain. The human cost was staggering, with over 20,000 men lost. This was not merely a naval defeat. It was a cataclysm that shattered Spanish naval supremacy for good. England's independence was secured, ensuring the survival and growth of Protestantism in Northern Europe at a time when its future was far from certain. The balance of global power began its long, slow shift from the Spanish Empire to the rising English and later British Empire. This shift opened the door for English colonial expansion in North America, reshaping the demographics and political landscape of the entire world. The winds that scoured the North Sea did not just sink ships, they redirected the entire flow of history, proving once again that no empire, no matter how mighty, is a match for the raw, untamed power of the sky and the ocean. Sometimes the fate of a revolution rests not on a battlefield but on the quiet surface of a river. By late August of 1776, the American cause for independence was on the brink of collapse. George Washington and his Continental Army, defeated in the Battle of Long Island, were trapped with their backs to the East River. Behind them, the full might of the British Empire and its Hessian allies was tightening the noose. In front of them lay only deep, impassable water. The British commanders, confident of their impending victory, decided to finish the job in the morning. They planned a final, crushing assault that would surely annihilate Washington's exhausted and outnumbered forces. Capture seemed inevitable, and with it, the end of the American Revolution. But Washington saw one last, desperate chance. He ordered every available boat to be gathered from along the river, from small fishing sloops to rowboats. Under the cover of darkness, a clandestine evacuation began. The operation was perilously slow. The oars were muffled with cloth, and the men were commanded to maintain absolute silence. Yet, as the night wore on, a new and unexpected danger emerged. A favorable breeze that had been helping to push the boats across the river suddenly shifted, threatening to stall the entire operation. With dawn approaching and thousands of soldiers still stranded on the shore, the mission was on the verge of catastrophic failure. Then, just as the first hints of light should have begun to silhouette the retreating army for the British sentries, something miraculous happened. A thick, heavy fog began to roll in from the sea. It was not just any mist. This fog was so dense and persistent that it clung to the river and the Long Island shore, creating an impenetrable white curtain. Under this divine blanket, the evacuation continued. The last of the soldiers, their equipment, and even their essential supplies were loaded onto the final boats. The fog held so perfectly that when the sun finally burned it away, the British troops stared in stunned disbelief. The entire American army had vanished into thin air. This was not merely a narrow escape, it was the salvation of the revolution itself. Had that army been captured, the rebellion would have been decapitated in a single blow. There would have been no crossing of the Delaware for a surprise attack later that year, no winter at Valley Forge to forge a disciplined fighting force. The entire narrative of American perseverance might have ended before it truly began. That single, inexplicable fog bank did not just hide an army. It preserved a dream of independence, proving that sometimes the weather itself can choose a side. The same forces that could save a revolution could also destroy an empire. In June of 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of France, stood at the peak of his power, commanding the most formidable army Europe had ever seen. With over 600,000 men, the Grand Armée, he launched an invasion of Russia, confident that a swift, decisive victory would force Tsar Alexander I to his knees. The Russians, however, refused to give the great battle Napoleon craved. They retreated deeper into their vast, empty land, practicing a scorched earth policy that left the French to march through a barren, desolate landscape with no food or supplies. When Napoleon finally reached Moscow in September, his prize was a hollow victory. The city was largely abandoned and soon set ablaze, leaving the French to occupy a smoldering ruin as the first chill of autumn began to bite. With no Russian surrender forthcoming and his supply lines stretched to breaking point, Napoleon had no choice but to order a retreat. That was when General Winter arrived with a vengeance. The cold came early and with unimaginable ferocity. Temperatures plummeted to -30, even -40 degrees. This was not the crisp cold of a European winter. This was a brutal, killing frost that seeped into the very bones of the army. Soldiers who had conquered nations froze to death in their sleep. Horses collapsed and were butchered on the spot for meat. Discipline evaporated in the face of starvation and hypothermia. The retreat became a frozen nightmare, a 100-mile-long column of ragged, desperate men being picked off by Cossack raiders and the relentless cold. The Grand Armée, which had marched into Russia as a magnificent force, was systematically annihilated. Of the over 600,000 men who began the campaign, fewer than 100,000 would ever stagger back across the border. This was more than a military defeat. It was the complete and utter destruction of Napoleon's primary instrument of power. His aura of invincibility, carefully cultivated over a decade of victories, was shattered forever. The disaster in Russia emboldened his enemies across Europe, leading to a new coalition that would eventually defeat him, force his exile, and redraw the entire political map of the continent. One man's failure to account for the simple, brutal reality of a Russian winter brought an entire empire crashing down, proving that the greatest general can be defeated not by another army, but by the climate itself. While Napoleon's empire fell to the cold, a different kind of climate disaster was brewing on the other side of the world, one that would prove no nation was immune. In April of 1815, on the island of Sumbawa in modern-day Indonesia, Mount Tambora exploded in the largest volcanic eruption in recorded history. The blast was heard over 1,200 miles away, and it ejected so much ash and sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere that it created a global sunshade. The following year, 1816, became known as the year without a summer. Snow fell in New England in June. July and August brought killing frosts to Pennsylvania. In Europe, relentless cold rain and dreary skies became the norm. This was not a simple case of bad weather, it was a full-blown climatic catastrophe. The volcanic particles high in the atmosphere scattered incoming sunlight back into space, dramatically cooling the entire planet. The results were immediate and devastating. Crop failures were universal. Grain prices skyrocketed across Europe, leading to widespread food riots and famine. In the United States, farmers who had pushed west into New England and upstate New York watched their fields wither and die, prompting a mass migration to the more fertile soils of the Midwest. But within this global crisis, a strange and enduring cultural spark was lit. That same miserable summer, a group of writers gathered at a villa on Lake Geneva in Switzerland, forced indoors by the unending cold and rain. To pass the time, they challenged each other to write ghost stories. One of those guests, a young Mary Shelley, was struggling for an idea until a conversation about the principles of life turned her thoughts to a monstrous creation. The gloomy, storm-racked atmosphere outside, a direct result of Tambora's distant eruption, provided the perfect backdrop for her imagination. she later wrote of visions brought on by the weather, of a pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. From that dreadful summer was born the novel Frankenstein. So a volcanic eruption in Indonesia led to famine in Europe, spurred migration in America, and inspired one of the most famous monsters in all of literature. It is a powerful chain of events that shows how a single geological event can ripple through human society, touching everything from the price of bread to the very stories we tell in the dark. A generation after the volcanic gloom of the year without a summer, humanity would create its own climate catastrophe from the ground up. In the 1930s, the Great Plains of the United States became the stage for one of the most devastating ecological disasters in American history, an event so profound it would be etched into the national consciousness as the Dust Bowl. For decades, settlers had been lured to the region by the promise of rich soil, plowing under the native prairie grasses that had held the earth in place for millennia. When a severe, multi-year drought struck, that fragile, over-farmed land had no defense. The soil simply turned to dust. Winds sweeping across the plains lifted this dry earth into the air, creating colossal, rolling dust storms that blotted out the sun. These were not ordinary storms. They were black blizzards, towering walls of choking dirt that could travel for hundreds of miles, turning day into night and suffocating livestock. People stuffed rags under doors and windows, but the fine, powdery dust still seeped inside, coating everything in a layer of grime. It was a man-made desert expanding with each passing year. The economic devastation was absolute. Farms that had once been productive simply blew away. Crops failed, and with no income, families faced starvation and foreclosure. This environmental collapse triggered one of the largest internal migrations in American history. Hundreds of thousands of people, often derisively labeled Aukies regardless of their actual home state, packed their meager belongings into rickety cars and trucks and headed west on Route 66, desperately seeking work in the promised land of California. But the reality they found was often one of poverty and prejudice, competing for back-breaking agricultural labor in an already strained economy. This mass exodus and the profound suffering that fueled it was captured for the nation in John Steinbeck's masterpiece, The Grapes of Wrath. The novel gave a human face to the statistics, chronicling the Joad family's harrowing journey and their struggle for dignity. The disaster forced a national reckoning with how the land was being used. In response, the federal government established the Soil Conservation Service, promoting new farming techniques like crop rotation and terracing to prevent such a catastrophe from ever happening again. The Dust Bowl did not just deepen the Great Depression, it fundamentally reshaped the American relationship with the environment, teaching a brutal lesson that the land's bounty was not infinite, and that human ambition, when unchecked by wisdom, could literally turn the world to dust. The weather forecast for the English Channel in early June of 1944 was grim. A severe storm was brewing, promising high winds and rough seas that would make a naval landing impossible. For General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, this was a nightmare. The largest amphibious invasion in history, years in the planning, was scheduled for June 5th. The entire operation, codenamed Overlord, was in jeopardy. On the other side of the channel, German commanders looked at the same forecast and reached a logical conclusion. An invasion was off the table. The formidable defenses of the Atlantic Wall would not be tested, at least not for now. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, so confident of the impending poor weather, even left his post in Normandy to travel to Germany for his wife's birthday. But then something shifted. A team of Allied meteorologists working around the clock identified a narrow and temporary break in the storm system. They predicted a brief window of improved conditions for the morning of June 6th. It was a fragile, fleeting opportunity. Eisenhower faced the most monumental decision of the war. He could proceed with the risky landings in marginal weather, or he could postpone for weeks, potentially losing the element of surprise and the specific tidal conditions the plan required. With the words, "Okay, we'll go," he took the gamble. That decision, based on a sliver of a weather report, set the liberation of Europe in motion. As dawn broke on June 6th, the Allies achieved near-total surprise. The German High Command, convinced no sane general would invade in such conditions, was caught completely off guard. The landings themselves were chaotic and bloody, with many amphibious tanks foundering in the choppy seas and soldiers struggling through the surf under heavy fire. Yet that very chaos worked in the Allies' favor. The Germans had been lulled into a fatal sense of security by the bad weather. Their defensive readiness was relaxed and their reinforcements were slow to respond. That single, crucial beachhead was established, and from it, the Allies began the long, hard push into occupied France. Without that brief break in the storm, the entire invasion might have been delayed by 2 weeks, giving German forces more time to strengthen their defenses and uncover Allied deception plans. The entire timeline of the war in Europe, and with it the fate of millions, hinged on a commanding general trusting a weather forecast and rolling the dice on a sliver of clear sky. London had always known fog, but this was something entirely new. In early December 1952, a great stillness settled over the city. An anticyclone, a mass of high-pressure air, parked itself over southern England, bringing with it a bitter cold and, most critically, a complete absence of wind. As Londoners stoked their coal fires for warmth and the city's countless factories and power plants continued their normal operations, a deadly invisible cocktail began to accumulate. Sulfur dioxide, soot, and other pollutants from burning coal poured into the stagnant air. With no wind to disperse it, this toxic haze was trapped at ground level, growing denser with each passing hour. What began as a nuisance quickly became a catastrophe. The familiar London fog transformed into a thick, yellow-black smog so potent it seeped indoors, forcing theaters to close because the audience could not see the stage. Public transportation ground to a halt. Pedestal holders shuffled through the streets, unable to see their own feet, their lungs burning with every breath. The smog was not just an inconvenience, it was a poison. In the days and weeks that followed, the city's mortuaries began to overflow. The official death toll in the immediate aftermath was around 4,000 people, but later analysis suggests the true number was likely 12,000 or more, with over 100,000 people falling seriously ill. The victims were overwhelmingly the very young, the elderly, and those with pre-existing respiratory problems, their systems overwhelmed by the acidic, particulate-filled air. It was a silent, suffocating emergency that unfolded street by street, home by home. This disaster, however, did not fade quietly into memory. The sheer scale of the tragedy forced a public and political reckoning. The government launched an official inquiry which definitively linked the massive death toll directly to the air pollution, a connection that had been dismissed or ignored for years. The result was the groundbreaking Clean Air Act of 1956. This legislation established smoke-free zones in cities, promoted the use of cleaner burning fuels, and moved power stations away from populated areas. It was one of the world's first comprehensive environmental laws, a direct response to a weather event that had turned human pollution into a weapon of mass destruction. The Great Smog of London stands as a terrifying example of how the right meteorological conditions can act as a lid, trapping our own waste products until they become lethal. It proved that the air we breathe is a shared resource, and its protection requires foresight and regulation. This single event, born from a combination of cold weather and coal smoke, ignited the modern environmental movement, setting a precedent for governments around the world to finally intervene between industry and the atmosphere. 200 years after London's smog, another city built below sea level would face a different kind of weather-driven catastrophe. In late August of 2005, Hurricane Katrina gathered strength over the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico, growing into a monstrous Category 5 storm. While it weakened to a Category 3 before making landfall on the Louisiana coast, it was not just the wind that made it historic, it was the water. The storm surge, a colossal wall of ocean pushed ahead of the hurricane, slammed into the city's defenses. And those defenses, a complex system of levees and floodwalls designed to protect New Orleans, failed catastrophically. More than 50 levees were breached or overtopped. Water poured into the city's low-lying neighborhoods, not in a slow creep, but in a violent, unstoppable torrent. Entire communities were submerged within hours, transforming streets into rivers and rooftops into tiny islands of desperate refuge. The immediate aftermath was a scene of chaos and human suffering that played out on television screens across the nation. Tens of thousands of people, overwhelmingly the city's poorest and most vulnerable residents, were trapped in a drowning city without power, clean water, or food. They sought shelter in places like the Superdome and the Convention Center, only to find conditions rapidly deteriorating into squalor and desperation. The governmental response at every level was tragically slow, disorganized, and utterly inadequate. The images of citizens stranded on rooftops and crowded into overwhelmed shelters exposed a shocking failure of emergency planning and exposed deep, pre-existing fissures of race and class. The storm had ripped away the facade, revealing a community where the capacity to escape disaster was directly tied to economic means. The conversation in America shifted instantly from the raw power of the storm to the profound vulnerability of its people. Katrina was not just a natural disaster. It was a historical event that forced the nation to confront uncomfortable truths about poverty, infrastructure neglect, and systemic inequality. The storm's impact permanently altered the fabric of New Orleans, displacing hundreds of thousands of residents and dramatically changing the city's demographics, as many of those who evacuated never returned. It became a defining moment for a new century, a brutal lesson in how the weather does not just test our physical structures, but the very strength of our social contract, proving that the most dangerous fault lines are sometimes not in the earth, but in our society itself. A persistent chill settled over Europe for centuries. This was not a single storm or a bad winter, but a profound climatic shift that historians would later call the Little Ice Age. From the 14th to the 19th century, the continent was gripped by a long, slow cooling that rewrote the rules of survival. Glaciers advanced relentlessly down mountain valleys, swallowing entire farms. Rivers that rarely froze, like the Thames in London, hosted frost fairs on their solid ice. But this picturesque scene masked a brutal reality. The growing seasons became shorter and more unreliable. A late spring frost or a cool, rainy summer could doom an entire year's harvest. This climatic instability triggered the first in a series of catastrophes, the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. For years, unending rains and cold weather rotted seeds in the ground and ruined harvested grain. The result was a continent-wide food shortage so severe that people resorted to eating roots, tree bark, and even their own farm animals, destroying their future means of survival. Chroniclers of the time described parents abandoning their children and widespread reports of cannibalism. This famine killed millions, not through a single event, but through the slow, grinding agony of starvation, leaving the population weakened and vulnerable. Just a generation later, that vulnerability would be brutally exposed. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347, and the cold, malnourished population was the perfect tinder for the plague's fire. Weakened bodies from years of poor nutrition had little resistance to the disease. The rats that carried the fleas transmitting the plague may have also sought refuge from the cold in human homes, bringing the pestilence even closer. The combination of famine and plague wiped out an estimated half of Europe's population, a demographic collapse so profound it shattered the feudal system and altered the very structure of society. But the Little Ice Age was not finished shaping history. Its icy grip tightened again in the late 18th century, playing a direct role in one of history's most famous upheavals. The summer of 1788 was disastrous for French farmers. A severe hailstorm followed by a brutally cold winter and a parched spring led to catastrophic harvests. The price of bread, the staple food for the common person, skyrocketed. By the summer of 1789, a Parisian laborer might spend nearly 90% of their income just on bread to feed their family. Hunger turned to anger and anger to action when rumors spread that the Queen, Marie Antoinette, had callously said, "Let them eat cake." The fury of a hungry populace boiled over. The storming of the Bastille in July 1789 was not just a political act, it was the direct result of empty stomachs and a climate that would not cooperate. The French Revolution, with its cries for liberty and equality, was fueled in no small part by a bread shortage born from a freakish, prolonged cold spell. This centuries-long ordeal forced Europe to adapt or perish. Farmers abandoned high-altitude fields that were no longer viable. Societies developed new crop rotations and began cultivating hardier foods like potatoes and turnips. The very landscape of the continent was reshaped by a change in the weather that lasted for 500 years, proving that the most powerful historical force is sometimes not a king or an army, but a subtle, relentless drop in temperature. The chill of the Little Ice Age was a slow-moving glacier compared to the sudden, terrifying freeze that struck the ancient world. In the year 536, the sun simply began to fade. A mysterious, dusty haze descended across Europe, the Middle East, and vast stretches of Asia, casting a perpetual twilight over the land for 18 long months. The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote of a sun that gave no more light than the moon, a dim, feeble orb that left the world in a state of perpetual gloom. This was the dust veil, one of the most severe and enigmatic climate disasters in human history. Temperatures plummeted even in the height of summer. Snow fell in China during August. Crops failed from Ireland to Mesopotamia, leading to a catastrophic continent-wide famine. People were not just hungry, they were disoriented and terrified, living under a sky that had fundamentally and inexplicably broken. This was not merely a bad season, it was a planetary reset. Scientists now believe the event was likely triggered by a massive volcanic eruption, perhaps in Iceland or North America, that ejected so much ash and sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere that it acted as a global sunshade. Some evidence also points to a potential comet impact, scattering dust and debris across the atmosphere. Whatever the cause, the effect was absolute. The resulting famine weakened populations to a staggering degree, creating the perfect conditions for pestilence. Just a few years later, in 541, the Justinian plague erupted within the struggling Roman Empire. This was the first recorded pandemic of bubonic plague, and it ripped through a populace already brought to its knees by hunger. The disease killed tens of millions, devastating the empire's economy and crippling its military, just as it was attempting to reconquer its former western territories. The twin blows of the dust veil and the plague that followed did not just cause suffering, they shattered an empire and an era. The Eastern Roman Empire under Emperor Justinian never recovered its strength or its ambition. Its decline accelerated, and with its retreat, the great unifying structure of the Mediterranean world began to crumble for good. Trade networks collapsed, cities shrank, and the complex systems of classical civilization faded. The event marked a stark transition into what would later be called the Dark Ages, a period of cultural and economic fragmentation. How many empires have toppled from a single bad harvest? The crisis of 536 demonstrates that it only takes one atmospheric event, one long, cold, dark year, to erase centuries of progress and force humanity to begin again. The ocean was a pane of dark glass on the night of April 14, 1912. For the RMS Titanic, a ship celebrated as unsinkable, these were the most dangerous conditions imaginable. The North Atlantic was unusually calm, a state known as a millpond sea, with no breaking waves to lap against the base of drifting icebergs and create a telltale white surf. The air was bitingly cold, a sign they were entering a field of ice, yet the horizon was deceptively hazy. This created a phenomenon known as a thermal inversion, where a layer of warm air sits atop colder air, bending light and creating a false horizon that can hide objects in plain sight. That night, the lookouts in the crow's nest had no binoculars, and they were searching for white, shimmering bergs against a black sea. What they needed was the faint, white line of surf at an iceberg's base, but the calm water offered no such warning. When Frederick Fleet finally saw the massive, dark shape looming directly ahead, it was already too late. He rang the bell 3 times and phoned the bridge with the dreaded message, "Iceberg right ahead." The ship began its desperate, slow turn, but the encounter was inevitable. The weather had conspired to hide the threat until the very last second. This was not a simple accident. The White Star Line had received multiple wireless warnings about ice fields directly in the Titanic's path throughout the day. Some of these messages never reached the bridge, while others were dismissed by a captain confident in his ship's speed and invulnerability. The calm seas encouraged maintaining that high speed, a fatal decision when paired with the optical illusions of the night. The resulting disaster, which claimed over 1,500 lives, was a perfect storm of atmospheric trickery and human hubris. In its wake, the world was shocked into action. The first International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea was convened in 1914, establishing new, universal regulations that mandated enough lifeboats for all passengers, 24-hour radio watch on all passenger ships, and the creation of the International Ice Patrol to monitor the North Atlantic's deadly iceberg lanes. The sinking of the Titanic did more than change maritime law. It shattered the unshakable belief in technological progress and left a permanent mark on our collective imagination, a story forever frozen in that deceptively calm, deadly sea. The same sea that shattered the Spanish Armada 100 years earlier would now decide the fate of the English crown itself. By 1688, King James II, a devout Catholic ruling a predominantly Protestant England, had pushed his authority to a breaking point. His policies favoring Catholics and his new heir, a son who would ensure a Catholic dynasty, sent a wave of terror through the political establishment. In secret, a group of powerful nobles sent an invitation to the Dutch prince, William of Orange, a staunch Protestant and the king's own son-in-law, urging him to invade and take the throne. William assembled a massive invasion fleet of over 400 ships, an armada larger than the one Spain had sent a century before, and set sail for England in early November. King James, aware of the impending threat, positioned his powerful Royal Navy in the Channel, ready to intercept and destroy the invaders in a decisive battle. But the English ships found themselves trapped, pinned in the Thames estuary by a persistent, violent easterly gale. For the Protestant English, this was no ordinary storm. They called it the Protestant wind. This same wind, blowing relentlessly from the east, was a divine gift to William's fleet, pushing his ships swiftly and safely down the Channel while James's navy could only watch, helplessly becalmed and battered in their own harbors. William landed unopposed at Torbay on November 5th, a date celebrated in England as Guy Fawkes Day, already symbolic of a delivered Protestant salvation. The favorable winds did not stop there. When James finally mobilized his army to confront the invaders, a second storm system prevented his key Irish Catholic regiments from crossing from Ireland to reinforce him. Isolated and abandoned by his own commanders, who began to defect to William's side, King James ultimately panicked. He fled to France, throwing the Great Seal of the realm into the River Thames as he went, an act interpreted as an abdication. This was the Glorious Revolution, a coup accomplished with almost no bloodshed. its success orchestrated not by cannons but by the weather. The new monarchs, William and Mary, accepted the crown under the conditions of a revolutionary new document, the Bill of Rights of 1689. This established that the power to make laws and levy taxes resided in Parliament, not the king, creating the foundation of a constitutional monarchy. The political philosophy born from this event, the idea that a ruler's power comes from the consent of the governed and not from God, would cross the Atlantic and deeply influence the framers of the American Constitution a century later. A few days of stormy weather had not merely changed a king, they had redirected the very course of political thought, proving that the wind could carry not just ships but the seeds of modern democracy itself. 2 decades after Eisenhower gambled on a break in the clouds, another European war was decided not by a single forecast but by a whole season of brutal, unyielding cold. Adolf Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, began with stunning success in the summer of 1941. The German Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, tore through Soviet defenses, capturing hundreds of thousands of soldiers and driving deep into Russian territory. The Nazi high command was so confident of a swift victory before winter that they did not even issue proper winter clothing to their troops. This arrogance would prove to be one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in military history. The early autumn rains arrived first, turning the vast network of Russian dirt roads into bottomless seas of mud, a quagmire the Germans called Rasputitsa. Tanks and supply trucks sank to their axles, slowing the advance to a crawl. Then, just as the ground began to harden, the real horror began. The winter of 1941 arrived with a vengeance, weeks earlier than anyone expected, and with a ferocity the Germans could not have imagined. Temperatures plunged to -40 degrees, a cold so intense it defied human endurance. Machinery simply stopped working. Tank engines refused to turn over. Rifles and artillery pieces seized up, their lubricating oil turning to a thick, frozen paste. The German soldiers, still in their thin summer uniforms, were freezing to death by the thousands. They stuffed newspapers into their tunics for insulation and wrapped their feet in rags, but it was a futile defense against the killing cold. Men lost fingers to frostbite simply by touching the metal of their weapons. Sentries were found frozen solid at their posts. This was General Winter, a force more effective than any Soviet army the Germans had yet faced. While the German war machine froze in place, the Soviet Red Army was given a priceless gift: time. They used the brutal weather to their advantage. Fresh divisions, many equipped with winter gear, and T-34 tanks designed for these very conditions, were rushed to the front from Siberia. In early December, with the Germans at the very gates of Moscow and completely exhausted, the Soviets launched a massive counter-offensive. The German lines, stretched thin and paralyzed by the cold, were pushed back. For the first time in the war, the seemingly invincible Wehrmacht was forced into a full-scale retreat. The failure to take Moscow was a psychological and strategic earthquake. It broke the myth of German invincibility and ensured that the war in the East would become a long, bloody war of attrition that Nazi Germany was never equipped to win. The human cost was almost beyond comprehension, with millions of soldiers and civilians perishing in the frozen landscape. That single, unforgiving winter did not just halt an invasion. It shattered Hitler's grand ambition and turned the tide of the entire war, proving once again that no amount of military planning can overcome a fundamental disregard for the power of the climate. The Caribbean holds a terrible record, the story of the deadliest Atlantic hurricane ever known. In October of 1780, while the American Revolution raged to the north, the islands became the stage for a natural disaster of almost biblical proportions. The Great Hurricane of 1780 was a monster, a storm so immense that it essentially wiped out entire fleets. British and French naval forces, locked in their own bitter struggle for control of the rich Caribbean trade routes, were caught completely unprepared. The hurricane made landfall with catastrophic force, first striking Barbados, where the wind was said to strip the bark from trees before flattening every building on the island. It then churned its way through the heart of the naval theater. The sea became a maelstrom of splintered wood and drowning men. The Royal Navy saw at least 20 warships vanish beneath the waves, from massive ships of the line to smaller frigates, taking thousands of sailors to their deaths. The French fleet was similarly shattered, losing countless vessels and soldiers. The military ports of Martinique and St. Lucia were reduced to ruins, with scores of merchant ships joining the warships on the ocean floor. This was not a battle, it was an annihilation. The storm's timing was geopolitically perfect for the struggling American colonies. The catastrophic loss of ships and men forced Britain to divert precious resources, ships, and attention to rebuilding its shattered Caribbean presence, a massive and unexpected drain on its treasury and military logistics. With the British Navy suddenly stretched even thinner, their ability to effectively blockade the American coast and supply their own armies was significantly compromised. The French, though also damaged, found their primary European rival grievously wounded, a strategic shift that helped them maintain their crucial support for the American cause. A single storm, lasting only a few days, had done what no general could. It had altered the naval balance of a global war, proving that the weather could act as a silent, unpredictable, and overwhelmingly powerful ally. Deep in the lush jungles of Central America, the great Maya civilization reached a breathtaking peak. Their cities were marvels of stone, with towering pyramids that scraped the sky, bustling marketplaces, and a sophisticated understanding of astronomy and mathematics. Then, around the 9th century, something went terribly wrong. The grand plazas fell silent, the intricate calendars stopped being carved, and the jungle began to reclaim the stone cities, leaving behind one of history's most enduring mysteries. For centuries, we believed their collapse was caused by war or internal rebellion. But modern science has uncovered a far more insidious culprit, a slow-moving disaster written not in stone but in mud and rock. By analyzing cores of sediment from the bottom of ancient lakes and studying the growth layers of stalagmites from regional caves, climate scientists have pieced together a startling new narrative. The evidence is unmistakable, a series of devastating multi-decade droughts that gripped the Maya heartland right at the time of their collapse. These were not simple dry spells. The data reveals periods of intense aridity that could last for generations, turning reliable water sources to dust and pushing a complex society to its absolute breaking point. Imagine the slow, creeping dread as the rains failed year after year. The maize crops, the very foundation of the Maya diet and economy, would have withered in the fields. Reservoirs and canals, engineered to sustain vast populations, dried up, leading to catastrophic famine and thirst. This environmental stress fractured the social contract. The Maya kings, who derived their power from a perceived ability to communicate with the gods and ensure rain and fertility, were suddenly seen as failures. Their divine authority evaporated along with the water. What followed was a desperate chain reaction. Rival city-states, once connected by trade and alliance, turned on each other in brutal warfare, fighting over the last remaining resources. Inscriptions from the final years speak not of celestial events and royal births, but of captures and destruction. The social order unraveled completely. One by one, the great urban centers were abandoned. The people of Tikal, Kapan, and Paling did not vanish. They simply walked away from their magnificent stone cities, dispersing into the countryside or smaller, more sustainable communities. They left behind a silent, haunting landscape. This was not a sudden apocalypse, but a protracted unraveling driven by a climate that could no longer support their grand ambitions. The story of the Maya is a powerful cautionary tale carved from limestone and drought. It forces us to ask a difficult question: how resilient is our own complex society when faced with a changing climate? The Maya collapse reshapes our understanding of history, revealing that sometimes the greatest threat to a civilization is not a foreign army, but a shift in the very weather patterns it depends on for survival. Just weeks before the miraculous fog on the East River saved his army, George Washington faced a different kind of weather on the very same island, one that brought him to the brink of total ruin. In late August 1776, his untested Continental Army was dug into defensive positions on the heights of Brooklyn, staring down the largest British expeditionary force ever assembled. Washington believed his flanks were secure, protected by thick woods and the impassable salt marshes of Gowanus Creek. He was tragically mistaken. Under the cover of another dense, early morning fog on August 27th, a column of 10,000 British and Hessian troops moved silently through a little guarded pass in the hills. The fog that day was not a savior but a perfect cloak for the enemy. It muffled the sound of marching feet and concealed the glint of bayonets, allowing the British force to execute a flawless flanking maneuver completely undetected. When they emerged from the mist behind the American lines, the surprise was absolute. Panic ripped through the Patriot ranks. Soldiers who had never faced a coordinated European army were caught in a deadly crossfire, trapped between the main British frontal assault and the new enemy suddenly at their backs. The result was a slaughter and a rout. Hundreds of Americans were killed or captured in the frantic retreat, with many drowning as they tried to flee across the Gowanus Creek. It was a catastrophic tactical defeat that could have ended the war then and there. Only a series of stubborn rearguard actions and a dose of British overconfidence prevented the immediate annihilation of Washington's entire force, which was now bottled up on the Brooklyn Peninsula with the British Navy at its back. This defeat, so heavily influenced by that concealing fog, forced a complete change in American strategy. Washington realized his amateur army could not win a conventional, head-on fight against the British professional military. The dream of a quick, decisive victory evaporated in that Long Island haze. From that point on, the revolution became a defensive war of attrition, a desperate struggle for survival defined by strategic retreats, guerrilla tactics, and the simple, stubborn refusal to surrender. The same atmospheric condition that would soon save the revolution had first nearly destroyed it, a stark reminder that the weather does not play favorites. It is a blind, neutral force that can deliver victory or defeat with the same indifferent breath, leaving generals to gamble everything on the roll of nature's dice. The same dust storms that drove families from their homes also swirled their way into the nation's collective imagination. As black blizzards darkened the skies over the Great Plains, a very different kind of storm was brewing in Hollywood. The 1939 film The Wizard of Oz opens with one of the most iconic scenes in cinema history, a terrifying tornado that rips Dorothy Gale from her black and white Kansas farm and deposits her into the technicolor wonder of Oz. That twister was not born from pure fantasy. Its visceral power was drawn directly from the newsreel footage and newspaper headlines of the Dust Bowl era. The filmmakers studied photographs of those rolling, mountainous clouds of dirt, capturing their ominous, almost sentient movement to create a special effect that felt terrifyingly real. For audiences living through the Great Depression, that tornado was more than a plot device. It was a symbol they understood intimately, a force of nature that could tear your life apart in an instant. Dorothy's journey begins with a desperate wish to escape, to find a place where there isn't any trouble. Is not that exactly what the Ockies packed into their old trucks were seeking as they fled the ecological and economic collapse of their homeland? The film provided a powerful form of escapism, but it also mirrored a deep national yearning. Just as Dorothy dreamed of a world over the rainbow, millions of Americans clung to the hope of a better life beyond the next mountain range, a place where the skies were blue and the soil was rich. The song Over the Rainbow, sung as Dorothy longs for escape, became an instant anthem for a weary nation. It gave voice to a universal desire for a sanctuary from hardship, a sentiment that resonated with anyone who had lost a job, a farm, or their hope. In this way, a climate disaster was transmuted into art. The raw fear of the dust storm was repurposed into a cinematic spectacle, and the desperate hope for a fresh start became a timeless melody. The Wizard of Oz did not just entertain. It embedded the weather of the 1930s into the very fabric of American culture, proving that from the darkest clouds of despair, we can sometimes find the most brilliant and enduring sparks of creativity. The battlefield fell quiet under a torrential downpour on the night of July 2, 1863. For the exhausted armies at Gettysburg, this was more than a simple summer storm. It was a meteorological intervention that would help decide the fate of a nation. The Confederate commander, General Robert E. Lee, had committed to a desperate plan for the following day: a massive artillery bombardment followed by a direct infantry assault on the center of the Union line. His target was a seemingly weak point on Cemetery Ridge, but as the rain poured down, it soaked everything, including the paper cartridges that held the gunpowder for the Confederate cannons. Historians have long debated the storm's impact, but many believe that a significant portion of that precious powder was rendered damp and less potent. When the Confederate artillery opened fire the next afternoon, the much-anticipated barrage, intended to soften the Union defenses for General George Pickett's infantry, was less effective than Lee had hoped. Many shells flew harmlessly over the heads of the Union soldiers, exploding far to the rear instead of shredding the defensive line. This failure had immediate and catastrophic consequences. When the order was given, nearly 12,000 Confederate soldiers emerged from the trees and began their long, slow march across an open field, a mile of exposed ground. They advanced with breathtaking courage into a storm of Union artillery and rifle fire that had not been sufficiently silenced. The charge was a magnificent, tragic failure. The Union line held, and the Confederate army was shattered, forced into a retreat from which it would never fully recover. Gettysburg became the undeniable turning point of the Civil War, and the heavy rain the night before had played a quiet, crucial role. It was not a decisive storm or a divine wind, but a subtle shift in humidity that may have tipped the scales. The gunpowder was just damp enough, the Union defenses just strong enough, and the charge just bloody enough to break the back of the Confederate invasion. What if the night had been clear and dry? Would a full-strength barrage have cleared the way for a successful charge? We can never know for certain, but the rain that fell on Gettysburg serves as a profound reminder that the smallest atmospheric details can gather into a historical tide, washing away one future while ensuring the survival of another. For 8 relentless years, Alexander the Great's army had marched across the known world, undefeated and unstoppable. They had crossed deserts and scaled mountains, shattered empires and founded cities, driven by their king's insatiable thirst for the ends of the earth. Yet in 326 BC, on the banks of the Hyphasis River in India, this legendary force finally broke. The official reason was a mutiny, with his veteran Macedonian generals refusing to march further east, terrified of rumors about the colossal Nanda Empire that lay ahead, with its thousands of war elephants and immense armies. But beneath this fear of a human enemy lay a deeper, more elemental dread. The sky had opened up, they had marched headlong into the fury of the Indian monsoon. For soldiers raised in the dry Mediterranean climate, these rains were a form of warfare they could not comprehend. The downpour was not a passing storm, it was a ceaseless, weeks-long deluge that turned the world into a suffocating, liquid nightmare. The very ground beneath their feet dissolved into deep, clinging mud that swallowed supply carts and exhausted marching men. Rivers swelled into impassable torrents, severing their lines of communication and resupply. Leather rotted, armor rusted on their bodies, and bowstrings went slack, rendering their weapons useless. This was a logistical collapse orchestrated not by any general, but by the climate itself. Alexander, the master of battlefield tactics, had no answer for an enemy that was the very air and water around him. His army's spirit, hardened by a decade of combat, was being washed away by the relentless, demoralizing rain. The mutiny was not just a refusal to fight another battle, it was a desperate plea to escape an environment that felt actively hostile and alien. When Alexander finally conceded and turned his army back toward Babylon, it was a momentous surrender to a force greater than any human army. This decision, forced by the monsoon, carved the easternmost boundary of his empire and the entire Hellenistic world that followed. His dream of a unified world empire stretching to the Eastern Ocean evaporated in the torrential rain. Had his troops endured, a clash with the Nanda Empire could have rewritten the history of the Indian subcontinent, potentially weaving it into the tapestry of the Mediterranean world. Instead, Alexander's return journey led to his premature death just 2 years later, leaving his vast empire to be fractured by his squabbling generals. The monsoon rains of India did not just halt a march, they determined the cultural and political fault lines between East and West for centuries to come, a permanent border drawn not in ink or stone but in falling water. A bitter cold in Virginia could not stop the British Royal Navy from its duties, but it did inspire a moment of improvisation that would outlast the war itself. During the hard winter of 1862, while the American Civil War raged, a British naval officer named Rear Admiral Sir Thomas Desmond Gimlett was stationed with the fleet observing the conflict. The story goes that the frigid temperatures and the monotony of shipboard life led to a shortage of the officer's preferred spirit, gin. Faced with his ration of vodka, which he found less palatable, and a supply of lime cordial that was standard issue to help prevent scurvy, he decided to mix them. The result was a bracing, tart drink that cut through the chill, a concoction his fellow officers quickly adopted and named in his honor the Gimlet. This was more than a simple anecdote. It was a direct adaptation to the harsh weather conditions of a Virginian winter, a small act of culinary innovation born from necessity. The cold that influenced military supply lines and camp life also, in this instance, shaped social habits and taste. While soldiers on both sides huddled for warmth, this moment of mixology created a cocktail that would sail far beyond that wartime winter, becoming a classic enjoyed in bars around the world for generations. It serves as a charming, potent reminder that the weather's influence seeps into every crack of human existence, from the grand movements of armies to the very contents of a glass, proving that history is not only written in treaties and battles, but sometimes stirred and served over ice. Even the wine froze solid in its barrels. The Great Frost of 1709 was a cold so absolute it seemed to stop life itself. Across Europe, this winter stands as one of the most brutal chapters of the Little Ice Age, a deep freeze that gripped the continent for months. Temperatures plummeted to lows that modern instruments would struggle to record. Birds were said to have frozen in mid-air, falling from the sky like stones. Rivers as mighty as the Thames and the Seine became solid roads of ice. Inside homes, the ink froze in its wells, and the very spirits meant to provide warmth turned to slush in their bottles. This was not a simple cold snap. It was a planetary shudder that lasted for weeks, turning the world into a silent, crystalline tomb. The agricultural devastation was total. Orchards were killed to the root. Winter wheat, planted with the hope of a spring harvest, was utterly destroyed. The ground itself froze to an impossible depth, shattering the root systems of perennial plants and leaving the soil barren and unworkable for the season to come. When spring finally arrived, it was too late. The damage was done, and the stage was set for a continent-wide catastrophe. The resulting famine was one of the worst in European history. With no grain reserves and the next planting season ruined, the price of bread exploded. People resorted to eating grass, tree bark, and even their own leather goods in a desperate attempt to survive. Disease followed hunger, and over the following year, hundreds of thousands, perhaps even 1 million people, perished across France, England, and the German states. This was a demographic collapse that emptied villages and left entire regions scarred. This climate disaster also froze the gears of war. The War of the Spanish Succession, a massive conflict involving nearly every major European power, was brought to a complete standstill. Armies, which were massive, mobile cities of men, found themselves immobilized. Soldiers, ill-equipped for such cold, died in their tents from exposure. Supply lines, the vital arteries of any army, were severed as wagons could not move through the deep snow and frozen ruts. Military campaigns planned for the early spring had to be abandoned entirely. The deep freeze became a strategic actor, a neutral force that dictated a ceasefire no treaty could enforce. The economic and social shockwaves were profound. The famine bankrupted governments and shattered local economies built on agriculture. The sheer scale of the suffering eroded public faith in rulers and institutions who were seen as powerless against the wrath of nature. This single, extreme winter exposed the terrifying fragility of pre-industrial life. It demonstrated that no matter how grand a king's ambition or how powerful his army, a shift in the wind, a drop in the temperature, could bring everything to a halt, forcing us to ask a humbling question. How many of history's grand plans have been quietly undone not by a rival, but by a simple, relentless change in the weather? A prisoner's slow journey home can become a greater victory than any battle. For 5 years, Pope Pius VII had been Napoleon Bonaparte's captive, arrested in the Vatican and held in remote locations across France as the emperor tried to break the Church's power and bend it to his will. But with Napoleon's empire collapsing in 1814, the Pope was finally a free man. His return to Rome was meant to be a simple journey, a quiet restoration. Then the weather intervened. As his carriage approached the Alps, a series of brutal, unseasonable snowstorms descended, blocking the high mountain passes and forcing his procession to a complete halt. For weeks the Pope waited, a patient figure stranded by the very forces of nature that had once destroyed his captor's army. This delay, however, was a gift in disguise. News of his impending return spread across Italy, and with each day he was held in place by the snow. Public anticipation grew into a frenzy. The spontaneous celebrations that had been planned for his arrival now had time to organize and amplify. By the time the weather cleared and his carriage finally rolled into Rome, the city was prepared not for a quiet homecoming, but for a massive, ecstatic triumph. Crowds surged into the streets, weeping with joy and tearing the horses from his carriage so they could pull it through the city themselves. This was not merely the return of a religious leader. It was the restoration of a spiritual and moral authority that Napoleon had tried and failed to erase. The arduous, weather-delayed journey had transformed Pope Pius from a former prisoner into a living symbol of resilience. His triumphant re-entry into Rome sent a powerful message across a war-weary Europe. It demonstrated that the papacy had outlasted its imperial persecutor, that its power came not from armies but from faith. This single, storm-extended return helped re-establish the political and spiritual prestige of the Catholic Church at the very moment the map of Europe was being redrawn, proving that a journey slowed by snow can sometimes allow a legend to run far ahead. A few decades of warmth can unravel a civilization. While the slow chill of the Little Ice Age brought famine, the years leading into the Great Pestilence were marked by a strange and unsettling shift. Tree rings and ice cores from Central Asia tell a story of unusual weather, a period of unseasonable warmth and heavy, persistent rainfall beginning around the 1330s. This was not a gentle spring, but a disruption that rippled through the ecosystem. For the bacteria Yersinia pestis, the cause of the bubonic plague, this was a perfect storm. The warm, wet conditions created a paradise for the real engines of the pandemic, rats and their fleas. Vegetation flourished, providing abundant food for rodent populations to explode. The fleas that lived on those rats, which carried the plague bacteria in their guts, also multiplied in the humid air. As the rat colonies grew, they spilled over into human settlements, carrying their deadly passengers with them. The plague had simmered in Asia for years, but the weather provided the fuel for its terrifying leap across continents. From the steppes of Mongolia, it traveled along the Silk Road, hitching a ride on the very trade routes that connected the world. Infected fleas nestled in bundles of cloth and sacks of grain stowed on merchant caravans and ships. By 1347, the disease had reached the bustling port of Messina in Sicily. From there, it spread with horrifying speed. The symptoms were gruesome and unmistakable. Victims developed swollen, painful lymph nodes called buboes in their armpits and groin, often turning black from internal bleeding, followed by high fevers and delirium. Death usually came within a week, sometimes in a single day. The mortality rate was staggering, wiping out an estimated third of Europe's population in just a few years. Whole villages were emptied, left to the weeds and the wolves. The scale of the death was so vast it shattered the medieval world. The old certainties of faith, authority, and social order crumbled. With so many laborers dead, the surviving peasants found their work was suddenly valuable. They could demand higher wages and better conditions, breaking the centuries-old chains of serfdom. The power of the feudal lords began to wane. The Catholic Church, which had failed to stop the plague or explain why a merciful God would allow such suffering, saw its immense authority deeply undermined. This collective trauma forced a new focus on individual life and human experience, a shift in thinking that would help seed the ground for the Renaissance. The path from a warm, rainy season in Asia to the rebirth of European art and philosophy is a long and twisted one, but it is undeniably there. A small change in the climate supercharged the deadliest pandemic in history, proving that the weather does not just shape our environment, it can also shape the very structure of our souls. For the Greek army gathered at Aulis, the sea was a dead end. 1,000 ships stood ready to carry the vengeance of Menelaus to the walls of Troy, yet for weeks on end, an unrelenting northerly wind pinned them fast to the shore. This was no ordinary calm. To the warriors and their high king, Agamemnon, this persistent, unnatural stillness felt like a divine hand holding them back. The seer Calchas, a man attuned to the whispers of the gods, delivered a terrible verdict. The goddess Artemis was angered, and the wind would not change until Agamemnon offered the ultimate price to appease her, the life of his own daughter, Iphigenia. The king faced an impossible choice: abandon a war sworn to by all of Greece, or become the murderer of his child. He chose ambition. Lured under the pretense of a glorious marriage to the hero Achilles, the young princess was brought to the altar. Her sacrifice, as the myths tell it, was the key that unlocked the winds, filling the sails of the fleet and setting in motion one of the most famous wars in history. We can never know if a real drought or a seasonal shift in the Aegean wind patterns was interpreted as a divine omen, but the psychological truth of the story is undeniable. For an army waiting and straining for battle, any prolonged delay would have bred superstition and fear. The weather became a character in the drama, a force that demanded a horrific ritual to prove their commitment. This moment, frozen in Homer's Iliad, established a powerful and enduring theme, that nature is not a blind force, but a messenger of the gods, one that can demand the most unthinkable sacrifices from humanity. The story of Iphigenia echoes through thousands of years of Western literature, a tragic foundation for countless tales where the weather is not merely setting, but a plot device that tests the very limits of human morality. How many other decisions, buried deep in our past, were made because a king or a chieftain looked at a storm cloud and saw the face of an angry god? From the divine winds that saved Japan to the fog that preserved a revolution, the weather has proven itself as history's most unpredictable and powerful player. We have seen how a single storm could shatter an empire's grand ambition, as it did for the Spanish Armada, and how a general's disregard for winter could destroy his entire army, as Napoleon learned in Russia. We have watched as commanders like Eisenhower gambled everything on a fleeting break in the clouds, and as entire civilizations like the Maya slowly unraveled when the rains they depended on simply failed to arrive. These are not isolated incidents. They are a pattern, a recurring reminder that our greatest plans are always subject to the silent veto of the sky and the sea. The next time you check the forecast, see it as more than just a prediction of rain or sunshine. See it as a glimpse into the very forces that have saved nations, toppled kings, and redirected the flow of our entire world. What other historical events do you believe were secretly decided by the weather? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this journey through the mysteries of our past, be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden forces that have shaped our world.